How do soldiers vote while deployed in combat? And how are elections held during wartime? This video was inspired by a tweet from a Twitter user named Mike Sirkanovich, who claimed that President Zelensky had banned elections in Ukraine. This is a very odd thing to claim because apparently Mr. Sirkanovich has a law degree from Pepperdine, and you would think a lawyer would actually read and understand the constitution of the country he's discussing. So I actually read the Ukrainian Constitution, and according to Article 83 of the Ukrainian Constitution, elections can't be held during martial law. And that got me thinking, how do you hold an election during a war? Now, election season in America is almost upon us, so how do we tell the real news from the fake news? So today, I'm partnering with Ground News. So click the link in the description below or go to ground.news/ryanmcbeth to stay fully informed. Subscribe through my link to get 40% off the Vantage plan for unlimited access this month only. I actually pay for Ground News. It's part of my daily routine. I wake up, I read my email, I check YouTube, I read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Ground News. I actually paid for Ground News. They do not give it to me for free. Ground News is a news aggregator, and it helps you understand biases in your news consumption. And their blind spot feature is going to be critical for this upcoming election because it shows you stories that you might have missed. Ground News also gives you a factuality rating and the ownership data for each publication, so you know exactly who is behind the scenes telling you what they think you should know. So go to ground.news/ryanmcbeth to stay fully informed. Subscribe through my link to get 40% off the Vantage plan for unlimited access this month only. Now let's talk about how soldiers vote in elections. You know, I was at Camp Victory, Iraq in 2008 during the presidential election. Now, I actually don't remember the process for voting. I think I requested an absentee ballot from New Jersey online, which was then mailed to me in Iraq. I filled out the ballot, dropped it in the outgoing mail, and that was that. But I was at a comparatively safe place on Camp Victory where I could cast my vote. How could you exercise your right to vote if you were on the front lines in Afghanistan or on a Navy ship? Turns out this has been a problem for Americans ever since the American Civil War. The American Civil War was the first time that the United States had to consider the problem. Now back then, America wasn't into large professional armies. In fact, Founding Father Alexander Hamilton was quoted in the Federalist Papers as saying, "Large standing armies are dangerous to liberty." America had just finished a war with a pretty tyrannical king, and a large professional army was viewed as a needless expense and a potentially dangerous tool that could be used by a tyrant. At the start of the Civil War, the U.S. had about 16,000 officers and enlisted men, and most of them were stationed in the West on the frontier. The Navy only had about 7,600 sailors. Allowing those servicemen to exercise their suffrage just wasn't a priority. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, but I wrote this script on a laptop in Tampa, Florida. It took me about 2 hours to fly from BWI Airport to Tampa. But back in the 18th century, travel was a heck of a lot slower, so people just didn't travel. And when they did, it was usually to the closest town in order to bring their goods to market. So absentee ballots weren't really a thing. Incidentally, that whole market thing is why voting is held on Tuesdays in America. They couldn't do it on Sundays because most Americans were devout Christians. Wednesday was a normal market day in town, and sometimes farmers needed a travel day. So Tuesday was the best possible day since you could walk to town on Monday, stay overnight to vote, and then sell your goods in the town market on Wednesday. Now, back in the 1800s, you mostly had to be white, male, and a property owner in order to vote. But there were exceptions and restrictions. New York allowed people of color to vote only if they owned $250 worth of property and were debt-free. Maryland didn't allow Jews to vote until 1828. And most states require that you be a property owner. States like New York, Pennsylvania, or Ohio removed or substantially reduced the property qualifications for voting. By the Civil War, no states had the property requirement remaining, but the idea of absentee voting was just inconceivable. States like Maryland and New York required voting in your local election district. Vermont required ballots be delivered in person to the town constable. So what you had was this mishmash of laws, since the power to decide the manner of elections in America was decided by each individual state. Now, the presidential election of 1860 was a four-way race between Republican Abraham Lincoln, Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, Southern Democrat John C. Breckinridge, and Constitutional Unionist John Bell. Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party believed in the abolition of slavery, and this would have been a major hit to the southern states who relied on slaves as the backbone of their labor-intensive agrarian society. Abraham Lincoln won the election on November 6, 1860. By December 20th, South Carolina seceded from the Union. The next 2 months saw multiple states secede, and various southern state militias captured federal military installations and arsenals. On May 3rd, 1861, President Lincoln called for volunteers to join the Army for a 3-year term. Now, remember how I said that state militias were the predominant military force in America? Well, both sides thought that this would be over quickly, and young men from both the North and the South rushed to join their state militias. Units from Pennsylvania, Delaware, Vermont, New Jersey, New York, Maryland, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan left their home states, and for many of these kids, it was their first time. This barely trained Union Army ran smack into the Confederate forces about 30 miles southwest of Washington, D.C., near a town called Manassas. And for a lot of those kids, the first time they left home would be their last. The battle was a defeat for the Union Army, and that's when people started realizing that this war might take longer than they thought. The year of 1862 was a midterm election, and for my foreign viewers, that means that there's no presidential election on the ticket, but there were elections for Congress. Some states, like Wisconsin and Minnesota, both passed laws allowing for absentee voting. Wisconsin allowed militia officers to administer elections in camp. Minnesota allowed voters to mail in a ballot that was sealed with wax back to the election officials back home. Now, even this was kind of weird. You know how I said there was no presidential election on the ticket? Well, back in the 18th century, the government didn't actually print up ballots. You either wrote who you wanted to vote for on a piece of paper, or more commonly, you got a pre-printed ballot from the newspaper that was affiliated with your political party. That was your ticket. So soldiers who wanted to vote absentee had to come up with an entirely new way of voting. And different units used different methods. Depending on state law, some used ballot boxes that could be sealed, others mailed their ballots home in dispatches. Now, the war raged on. On the Union side, the Militia Act of 1862 required that states who couldn't meet their draft quota draft citizens. By 1863, the Union passed the Conscription Act, which required that all males between 20 and 45 years of age enroll in the draft. By 1864, there were about 1 million men in the Union Army. That is a heck of a lot of voters who were away from home. President Lincoln was worried. You see, his opponent in 1864 was this former Union general named George B. McClellan, who was running on the Democrat ticket. McClellan and the Democratic Party favored a negotiated peace with the South, which would have seen the southern states readmitted into the Union with their slavery laws untouched, and this would not do. Now, for another quick note to my foreign viewers, in the American political system, we don't actually vote for the president. When you vote for a president, you're actually voting for electors. These electors are based on the total number of senators and representatives in Congress. America has 2 houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. A state with 2 senators and 3 representatives would have 5 electors. And the number of senators is fixed at 2. The number of representatives is assigned to each state based on the U.S. Census. So these electors then meet and cast the real vote for president. In most states, it's winner take all, but in some states like Nebraska and Maine, assign a portion of their electors based on the popular vote in each congressional district, and the statewide winner gets 2 additional electoral votes. So it's very important to win each state in order to become president. Now, Lincoln was popular among the troops, so word went out to the state Republican parties to figure out how to do absentee ballots to give Lincoln an edge. Needless to say, some Democrats oppose this legislation, with some going so far as to suggest that they allow soldiers furloughs to go home and vote in the hopes that distance and inconvenience would prevent a vote for Lincoln. But some states like Maryland, Ohio, Missouri, Minnesota, and Connecticut allowed absentee ballots, although this was only for soldiers, not for any civil administrators or journalists who were traveling, and only for the duration of the present rebellion. In fact, Ohio even authorized special ballot boxes be constructed for their state militia. If you're curious to see one, a link to the Civil War Digest channel is below. Needless to say, Lincoln won the election, although absentee ballots weren't that much of a factor. While we can't estimate the soldiers who were furloughed to go vote, it's estimated that Lincoln received about 119,000 absentee votes to McClellan's 34,000. The strategy kind of worked, at least in one state, which was Connecticut. Lincoln won the state by 2,406 votes, and the absentee ballots from soldiers totaled 2,898 for Lincoln. But there was one other curious case. I live in Maryland, and the state of Maryland at that time was a member of the Union, but it was a state where slavery was legal. Abolitionists pushed for a new state constitution which banned slavery. The bill failed until 375 absentee ballots from Marylanders serving in the Union Army were counted, and slavery was abolished in Maryland. Now, the end of the Civil War saw a period of what we call Reconstruction. This was a time between 1865 and 1877, which aimed to rebuild the nation and address the aftermath of slavery. It established the Freedmen's Bureau to assist newly emancipated slaves. It saw the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to guarantee freedom, citizenship, and voting rights for African Americans, and to establish biracial governments in the southern states. But once the southern states were admitted back into the Union, they started a practice known as Jim Crow. This is going to become important later. Jim Crow laws created an environment of segregation, disenfranchisement, and the systemic discrimination against African Americans. One of the tricks used to enforce segregation and majority white rule was the poll tax. This tax required that you pay a fee before you could vote. Many southern states enacted poll taxes as a means of excluding African American voters, most of whom were poor and couldn't afford to pay a tax. So let's leap forward to World War I. The U.S. didn't enter the war until the spring of 1918, and for some states, like Connecticut, they authorized absentee voting, but only for the duration of the conflict. This was also the first time that women served overseas as nurses and telephone operators. And this helped convince many Americans, including President Woodrow Wilson, that the country's female citizens deserved a right to vote. Women received the right to vote on August 26, 1920, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, by 1941, Europe was descending into darkness. Japan was cutting its way into the Pacific. Franklin Roosevelt was on his third term in office, and the world was careening toward war. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8th, and the mighty sleeping giant awakened. By 1942, as the midterm elections rolled around, the military had swelled to about 4 million or so personnel, and the U.S. House of Representatives considered legislation to create a war ballot. Now, this legislation would require each state's Secretary of State to print and supply soldiers with war ballots listing the candidates running for federal, state, and local offices. But there would be a three-part process. First, the Army was to provide its men with postcards to be mailed to the Secretary of State of each state to request a ballot. Then, the Secretary of State had to mail a ballot along with an oath to be signed by the soldier affirming that he was a citizen of the state and a qualified voter. And then the soldier had to return the completed ballot. This had a couple of problems. First, some states like Mississippi authorized absentee ballots for primaries but not for the general election. And some states like Kentucky had no provision for absentee voting at all. It also excluded women and people serving in the Red Cross, as well as soldiers who were at training camps in the U.S. but not yet overseas. And the final problem was the U.S. Army, who was concerned that they would be sending these postcards and ballots back and forth to the detriment of supplies and ammunition. There was also this one other thing. Remember how a few minutes back I said, but once the southern states were admitted back into the Union, they started a practice known as Jim Crow. This is going to become important later. It's later now. All of those southern states who had poll taxes to prevent African Americans from voting wanted to know exactly how they would collect their money for their poll tax via absentee ballot. Some lawmakers saw through this charade, and one representative from Indiana named Lewis Ludlow said, What a travesty it would be to send Negroes by the multiplied thousands to the firing line to fight and die for freedom, and then tell them they shall have no part or parcel in the freedom at home for which they are sworn to support and defend with their lives. The end result was the 1942 Soldier Voting Act, which really didn't do anything. It allowed service members to cast absentee ballots so long as they continued to reside in the United States. People who were deployed overseas just couldn't vote. But there was a ray of sunshine. The bill eliminated the poll tax during that election for those who were serving. It was a chink in the armor of Jim Crow. But only 28,000 absentee ballots were cast. By 1944, the U.S. military had swelled to over 11 million personnel and was cast as far away as the Pacific Islands, England, and Italy. The nation was actually pretty politically divided. Franklin Roosevelt had already run for a third term, and that was unheard of. And now he wanted to run for a fourth term in 1944. This election was about to be the biggest absentee vote in history. And while Republicans and Democrats agreed on some pretty major stuff, such as fighting and winning a war, a lot of people were against President Roosevelt's liberal policies. Although Roosevelt was a Democrat, some members from his party, especially from the South, were afraid that if they allowed African Americans to vote freely overseas, when they return, they might get some ideas about social equality, and allowing them to vote freely would endanger majority white rule. This election of 1944 was going to be close. The winter of 1943 saw Congress debate altering the 1942 Soldier Voting Act. One proposal was to simplify the ballot with a federally printed ballot, which allowed the service member to simply pick their party, whether they wanted a Republican or Democrat in that particular position, instead of voting for an individual candidate. But then a serviceman couldn't split the ticket. If they wanted a Republican president, but they really liked their Democratic congressman, they were stuck with one or the other. This, along with the question as to whether this would even be able to be interpreted by the states, killed the bill. But overwhelming public opinion was in favor of allowing servicemen the opportunity to vote, and this was no small matter. Everybody knew somebody who was serving, and disenfranchising millions of servicemen was not an option. A new bill was proposed in 1944 to create a uniform voting process and a ballot to make voting as simple as possible, and was lightweight enough to be transported all over the world. The ballot looked like this. Now, the disadvantage is that you could have a soldier vote for a senator, and even if there was no senator up for election in that state. And as anyone who lived through the hanging Chad debacle of the election of 2000 remembers, it is certainly possible to misspell a candidate's name, which might draw the ballot into question. And what if there are names that are similar? For example, I remember back in 2006, a popular incumbent New Jersey House Republican, Jim Saxton, was running against a Democratic opponent named Rich Sexton. And Democrats were accused of intentionally running Rich Sexton to confuse voters at the ballot box. So you can only imagine the challenges that would arise if a service member misspelled a candidate's name wrong or put the correct candidate in the wrong box. Privates do stupid stuff all the time. Republicans accused Democrats of trying to rig the election in favor of Roosevelt because many of these servicemen, Roosevelt was the only president they had known. So who else's name would they write in the box? Odds are you're watching this video on a magical box or even a phone that has the ability to conjure up all of human knowledge. Without looking, can you tell me who was running against Roosevelt in 1944? I'll save you the time. It was Thomas Dewey. But would a soldier who's serving in the middle of Europe know that? So one compromise was that the servicemen would be allowed to write the word Republican or Democrat in the individual box if they couldn't remember the name of who they wanted to vote for. This bill passed in April of 1944. With this method, a postcard would be printed by the federal government. That postcard could then be sent to a state to request a ballot. If the state didn't have an absentee voting provision, the federal write-in ballot could be used. Each state was also to provide a list of candidates and their parties to be distributed abroad. The names and offices of the candidates were also published in the Army Weekly magazine, Yank. Now, the Soldier Voting Act of 1944 didn't contain a provision to eliminate the poll tax, so in some ways it was kind of a step backward. The poll tax, by the way, was finally put to rest in 1964 with the 24th Amendment to the Constitution. But the 1944 vote saw an estimated 3.4 million absentee ballots cast, which was a significant increase in the 28,000 cast in 1942. Still, 75% of soldiers and sailors didn't get a chance to vote, and there were significant problems, with some soldiers only receiving their ballots after the election. By 1968, the war in Vietnam was in full swing. The voting age was 21, but 29% of the casualties were of young men who were between the ages of 18 and 20 years old. In other words, old enough to serve their country, but not old enough to vote. The response was the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. In 1986, Congress passed the Uniform Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, which guaranteed voting rights, at least in federal elections, for United States citizens residing overseas. And in 2009, Congress passed the Military Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, or MOVE Act, of 2009, which required that states transmit validly requested absentee ballots to voters within 45 days of a federal election. Today, if a soldier wants to vote in an election, they can log on to the Department of Defense website and select their state. There they'll be guided through the absentee ballot process, or even be allowed to print up a backup ballot, which can then be emailed or mailed or even faxed to the state. We've certainly come a long way since the Civil War. And just in case you're wondering, sailors who are on ballistic missile submarines who are underway for months at a time normally cast their absentee ballots before they leave for sea duty. So, all that being said, all that history, could Ukraine hold an election during wartime? Yeah, well, if America could do it during the Civil War, it's certainly possible, especially with all the technology available to the average soldier and the fact that soldiers in Ukraine are often rotated out of the front lines. But that's a question for the Ukrainian government. Hey, if you like this content, this is my day job now. So if you want to support the channel, consider buying one of my shirts from Bunker Branding, like this Live, Laugh, Launch for Patriot shirt. It all goes to support content like this. You can also get a cameo greeting or subscribe to my Substack for $5, where I can show you all the content that I can't show on YouTube. Thank you guys so much for watching.
In a world where fashion meets firepower, where style becomes strategy, it's time to gear up for the ultimate mission with Bunker Branding. Introducing the Rock Out With Your Chalk Out t-shirt, a tribute to the fearless air cavalry. Feel the adrenaline rush as you don the pride of the skies. For those of you who dare from the air, precision and power unite when you think outside the bomb. And don't miss our Live, Laugh, Launch t-shirts for Patriot and HIMARS, because sometimes defending freedom means bringing the thunder. Finally, for the true defender of the seas, we present Department of the Boat People. Sail with honor and show your allegiance to the world's mightiest maritime force. With these shirts, hoodies, and stickers, along with the tow missile, landmines, and drone warfare. These aren't just shirts, they're statements. They're your way of saying I stand for strength, unity, and style. Get yours at Bunker Branding today.